very close. I'll write it down.
Okay, thanks. Can we find our seats and simmer down and we can start? Good. Well, good afternoon, and I hope the panel sessions and the round tables were really interesting and engaging. And we've got one more push, and then we can let our hair down, so to speak, and enjoy this evening. So typically, of course, you know, the way one organizes these events, you'd have the people who's on this panel anchor the different sessions. We have clearly sort of left the great and the good for last, and we've asked them not to do expansive sort of overview things in main keynotes, but rather to listen very attentively over the last 3 days and to pull out one or two ideas or thoughts or insights or implications of the discussions and the processes that really struck them. And so the brief is that the closing panel, we've asked each of the 4 panel members that is here to share some thoughts, and to do so in a relatively short space of time, 8 to 10 minutes if they wish. And then we will open the floor so that we can have an engagement and for you to share what you found really insightful, new, different, challenging. And what we are trying to do is to reflect on what the implications might be of having a convening where we bring different epistemic communities together, different policy networks, different activist coalitions, and what are the kinds of questions that emerge when we do that, and what stood out for you. And maybe there's a resonance between that which emerged for you and what the panelists may say or not, or maybe you would disagree. So this is a fairly open space. And I am not going to introduce any of them, because if you're at this conference and you don't know who these people are, then, you know, that's, as my son would say, that's your bad. So, so read the program. And we will follow the sequence that's in the program. And to remind you, in case you missed the apologies on the opening session, Ashil had administrative, bureaucratic matters to attend to back in Cameroon, and unfortunately, Eduardo Moreno had to be dispatched as the scout for UN Habitat to make sure that KL was ready for the World Urban Forum that is about to happen in a couple of days' time, and he was unable to swing via Cape Town. And just so that you know that it's not an excuse, Eduardo's daughter lives in Cape Town because she's a keen horse rider, and the only high school that offers that allows her to do that is in Cape Town. And so he was desperate to come, because he's been a single parent for the last 15 years and desperately misses her. So his heart is absolutely broken that he couldn't use our conference as an excuse to come via Cape Town on his way to KL. So he sends his warmest regards and thoughts, and he is indeed missed. So without further ado, I will hand over to the panelists to share their thoughts, and the mic will move from Teresa to Alcinda, and then to Malik, and Jenny will round us off, and then I will moderate the discussion thereafter. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. And I think those have been 3 incredible days. And the first thing that occurred to me to say is that these days have been possible because we're lucky to be part of the network generated by ACC. And this is a new institutional space that enables the production of critical knowledge and activism from the perspective of the global South and especially from the perspective of Africa. 10 years ago, such spaces like this one here did not exist. And today we have a handful of them, and ACC is certainly one of the leading ones. So we do have a lot to celebrate. The existence of this space and this network is certainly one of them. But obviously we have a lot of challenges to face to continue what we have been doing. And I will focus on what I think are some of those challenges, not to all of us who are here today and who are working with some of the issues that have been discussed here. So the first one has to do with the idea of Southern urbanism. As we went around the last days, we heard numerous mentions to Southern turn, Southern urbanisms, urbanisms of the South, and other similar terms. And I would like to urge us not to settle too easily on this idea, but rather to use our critical skills to consider it. And of course, I think it's great that we can easily talk about these notions and from their perspective, because 10 years ago, we're struggling to legitimate the idea that it was necessary to construct theories from perspectives beyond the North Atlantic. But the fact that we all succeeded, and obviously the people who are sitting here, Jenny wrote one of the first articles urging us to look into that direction, and we have worked all on it. And I think that there is the success of this work is the fact that we're here and easily talking about something that we can call the South turn or something like that. But I get anxious with some the uses that we're making of some ideas, and especially, I get very anxious about using the idea of Southern urbanism in the singular. And going around the rooms in the last days, it was clear that cities in the global South cannot be associated with one unitary form of urbanism. Thus, it's urgent to resist easy generalization and to use our critical skills to take apart this notion that we ourselves contribute to generate, exploring instead multiplicities instead of focus on the formation of a singular. And this was also very clear. For example, today in a discussion, there are two panels on the periphery, and I went in one of them, and the whole question is, what is this periphery? How can we conceptualize it? The singular, the plural, etc. So I think that some of the questions we should ask are we dealing with Southern urbanism or urbanisms of the South, something like that? If we're talking in the plural, then what does it mean for our theorizing? How to conceptualize these urbanisms? What does this South do for us? Or better, what do we want the South to do for us in our theorizing? And I would suggest that we take I'm an anthropologist, so I'd suggest that we take a qualitative approach to our work on this conceptualization. And what do I mean by that? And I think that the richness of our work on urbanisms of the South will come from working through differences, working with difference, insisting on variation, keeping differences at the forefront of our thinking instead of the other way around. This means to resist the attempt to establish broader common grounds, common denominators, but rather to undermine them as much as we can. It is this thinking through differences that will make us relevant, I believe, not the other way around. So at the same time that we are constantly interrogating our categories and resisting homogenization, we should insist on description and new theorizing. We need to create new archives, both of data and of theoretical references. And this, to me, is a crucial point. First, and obviously, we need to create new research that is open to the considerations of new standpoints. I guess we're all here embarked on this, but we need, for this to continue, we need both to create institutional space, such as this one, but also to find ways of circulating our ideas, to network, to listen to each other. Thus, we need to consider how to reform the institutions in which we work and to create new ones. But we also literally need to consider how to archive the data you create, how to make them circulate, how to make them available to researchers in other parts of the South and North. And in this direction, we need to consider how to use digital technologies to make data accessible. But you also need to consider issues of the protection of data, preservation of digital data, copyright, open source, how to retrieve data, etc. And obviously, this is a huge field, but something that we have to consider, maybe by borrowing expertise of some initiatives that are already doing this, such as projects of digital humanities and digital social sciences. I would say that it's this fundamental step to guarantee that the research we produce will be engaged with by other researchers across the global South. Because basically, in one of the panels that I was this morning, someone said, well, I couldn't cite your work because it costed $6 to download the article. So if people in the global South cannot download our work because it costs, I don't know how many dollars to download each article, and if they cannot have access to the data we generate so they can use it comparatively, for example, then I think we have a problem. So there are some issues involved here that are huge, from ethics to authorship, from the development of applications to the creation of platforms to translations. But I think we should struggle to them, and I think we should find ways of doing it. And there are several other issues associated with this. An obvious one is publication. I could not make it to the debate about journals and publications this afternoon, but I'm sure several issues were brought there. Another one is the alternative, not the most academic. Journals are the most academic versions of publications, but there are other alternatives. There are cityscapes, but there are blogs, and I think that we should try to reinvent blogging for the circulation of research. And that's anyway, maybe we want to think about that. And I just want to make one final point. We started our discussion 2 days ago with that idea of being critical and propositional. And we have debated in various different ways the approaches to knowledge and activism, research, and policymaking. And I do think that probably most of us accept the idea that we should navigate across these spaces. I'm not sure we agree on how to do this. And obviously, I'm not looking for any kind of recipe here on how to do it, but I think we should consider the questions on how to construct our positionalities when we transverse those spaces. In other words, I think we should consider questions such as, what are the limits of my intervention as a researcher? What is the type of voice I can construct when I write about, and especially when I write for a collectivity? What does it mean to be a public intellectual? And what are the limits of my capacity as a public intellectual? So anyway, those are some of my comments. And once again, thank you, Edgar, and thank you, ACC, for providing us this space here for our conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Edgar, for inviting me to join this conference and this conversation. I'm going to make a few points, maybe three, about some of the issues that I found that kind of came to mind during these 3 days, and also some of the issues that could be require further research. The first one is the issue of the city and its meanings. The city that is this fascinating place of inquiry as it retains past and present meanings imputed by people to their physical surroundings. Urban spaces that are the manifestation of multiple representations. They embody and reflect expressions of economic, political, social, and cultural processes experienced by people. So this idea that the ways in which we see, we read the city depends very much on the perspectives and the perceptions that we have and on our location. And the city that is in a constant state of flux, of distraction, and of renewal. And those were things that in the various, the few panels that I sat in, I saw this kind of coming to the fore. And also the issue that as new developments occur, there is also the sense of continuity as the physical and mental representations of the past still remain and impact on new and future developments. As someone who works on youth, the second point I want to make is how young our cities are, African cities are, that they are really disproportionately young. For example, I think I saw some figures of 2014 that the median age of African city dwellers were estimated at 20 years of age. And so this youthfulness makes African urban landscapes unique as the young navigate, interpret, and negotiate their space in the city. And I think young people have really a lot to offer, not just because of this idea of them being the fresh contact with society and not taking lock, stock, and barrel the economic, social, and cultural repository that they received from previous generations, but a certain rebelliousness and need to contest, to change, to transform. And so I think this is a rich potential for our cities. The other issue also linked to young people and to people in general is the idea of the link that people have with their city or urban surroundings. And urbanization is a relatively kind of new process in the continent, and how people's biographies are also shaped by, and their experiences are also shaped by their urban surroundings. The interplay of biographies and cityscapes, people to a certain extent reveal individual and collective memories and feelings that resonate or that are linked to sites, monuments, streets, corners, buildings, odors, noises that have to do with their life experiences in the city. And also those experiences in a way ground them in a new community, the urban community, that particular context that they are still crafting and trying to make sense of. And it allows them to generate their own visualizations and patchworks of their lived city stories and histories. Another point is that also came up was for me and was a very important issue of language and the city and the issue of language production. it is especially youth, but I think people and urban people in general, this kind of creativity, linguistic creativity in African cities, which is remarkable, and I think it merits further research. Young people and city dwellers in general adopt fluid, homegrown language to express ideas and experiences that are specific to their own emerging urban culture. How do you live in a city? How do you interact with other people? And how do you express that? And the new linguistic forms provide young people with images, and people in general with images, conceptions of themselves individually and collectively, and the realities that surround them. And for example, we saw in Philippe's presentation the whole idea of the hall or the mountain or the tower and all these metaphors and the new language that is attached to the experience of living in the city. Or for example, certain neighborhoods in cities that gain specific names that are that represent a particular experience. For example, in Maputo, there is a part of the city that is called Colombia. And Colombia, why? Because that's the place where there is great circulation of drugs and drug dealers, etc. And so Colombia means something. Or in a neighborhood that is very dangerous, in Kenya. I think I was in Kenya at one time, and someone said, you know, stay away from Iraq. So there was that little place, etc. But there are also other forms of language that, in a way, then are linked to a certain kind of protest. For example, in Ouagadougou, the idea of the broom and the ballet. The ballet is a broom. And so they created, it's something that gave rise to this social movement, le ballet citoyen. Le ballet citoyen is the citizen's broom. So it's this idea of the dirt in the city, of a city that is not working, and the people have to come out and sweep and clean the dirt in the city. So the idea of ballet citoyen. But also in Senegal, the idea of enough. We tired of this, the Yanamar idea, which started when there were problems with electricity in Dakar. So this group of young people, they kind of got together and created this Yanamar to protest against these frequent cuts in electricity. Dakar was dark for many, many months with just short periods of energy. And then this grew into something else. And from here, probably I'll move into social movements, youth social movements, and cityscapes and how they relate to that. And in a way, these youth social movements articulate discursively and in political practice the anguish of spatial marginality with concerns of social inequality, racism, and quests for justice. People's location and relationship, both imagined and lived, to cityscapes becomes a strategic terrain for contestation and political protest. And it highlights, to a certain extent, contemporary urban geographies of marginalization, segregation, and poverty. For example, in Mozambique, in the riots or manifestations against the government that happened in 2010, it was really the people who lived, those who only came to the so-called city of cement, the previous colonial city, and coming from the poor areas of the city, they came to work. And so the whole protest and the demonstrations was to block the city and not allowing all the workers to enter the city. So in a way, they isolated the city of cement, and they burned tires all around the city. And so those who were in the city at 6 in the morning, because you live there, you become trapped there. and the free zone was outside the city. So in a way, this was kind of reflecting issues of justice, inequality, etc. And so this idea of the location of the protest and using the city and its landscapes to voice and give meaning to it. The same with riots in which specific, especially luxury or particular shops and establishments are looted by rioters. They're kind of sending a message about that. And I recall that that was not just in Africa that happens. I remember the London riots, I think in 2012, that they went into the Gucci stores, all this idea of modernity and things that they couldn't afford. So this idea of protest of the luxury stores and Apple and some of these. But I think also culture, popular culture and art, it's also a way of contestation and of expression, of dealing with the city, of making your mark in the city. And this reminds me of graffiti as a form of creative expression and contestation, as young people in many urban contexts are expressing themselves and transforming urban landscaping using graffiti and other forms of street art. These forms of self-expression often entail transgressions, and they are seen often as rubbing closely against ambiguities of people who might think what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, or whether it is vandalism or it's self-expression, whether it's legitimate or illegitimate. So those kinds of citizen action and urban citizenship that are manifested by those who inhabit the cities, and they express their feelings about their surroundings. And I think all those are issues that are, worth continue to think about and try and look at how people living in the cities understand them, express them, try and find ways of being creative and pursue fulfilling, as much as they can, fulfilling lives in their environment. And I think that's all. I'll stop here.
Pardon my notes. I'm certainly not going to speak for Achille, but if Achille was here, he would have reiterated, I am sure, the point made by Professor Lopez this morning about the free circulation of bodies across the region. But he may have gone on to emphasize that this kind of free circulation constitutes a kind of restitution and reinvention of a capacity to demonstrate urbanization through the configuration of thick networks of complementarity and interdependency through movement, through energized circulating systems, where the city is not the primary locus of urbanization, even if now demographically it is now an expansive and unwieldy proposition. But that somehow that what was inherent in a kind of history of the region was not a lack of urbanization, but urbanization through the capacity of different kinds of people and places to circulate through each other and to configurate thick coagulants of capacity and economy. What Christian Schmidt and some of his research associates now would emphasize as a kind of critical process of extended urbanization. That is not just the circulation of individual bodies, but histories of collective capacity, a massive quilting process of stitch and weave that constitutes a materiality of entanglements, and that these entanglements are a kind of form of the urban. That the promise of decolonization was, in some sense, the promise of a new human less preoccupied with interiorized landscapes, with the landscapes of the interior, but rather the exterior and extended relationships with a meshwork of non-human entities. When I took my first official job in an African city, Abidjan, in 1976, there was little urban research anywhere, let alone any urban-focused policy or programmatic interventions. In terms of the kind of popular imagination of bureaucrats and even academics, Africans were largely deemed biologically and culturally incapable of being urban. Cities were largely conceived as the imminence of disaster, replete with countless insufficiencies. So within such conditions, how could one conduct research? How could one, in some sense, even start a kind of research project? So if you were to do research at that time, it required an appreciation of what was present, what had a sense of there-ness. And that there-ness was individuals, households, and localities extending themselves across the multiplicity of sites, engagements, which in turn entailed a sense of generosity and patience, and above all, a willingness to recognize oneself through a range of different and disparate languages, images, and dispositions. A colleague of mine in Rio, Laura Kemmer, reminds me of a karaoke expression, staying with the promise. What does it mean to stay with the promise? So staying with the promise of this kind of decolonization, which means how to be anchored in motion, how to anchor oneself with particular kinds of aspirations and self-knowledge, with the recognition that those aspirations can be concretized in many different forms at many different times. So back in the day, back in the mid-70s, back then doing urban research required a sense of the extensive, of extending oneself to different kinds of actors as co-investigators, to be co-investigators with touts and preachers and hustlers and bureaucrats and teachers and market vendors. It was really, really difficult work. I mean, one of the giants of African urban thinking, Akon Mabagunjo, for years worked in utter marginalization from the academy. One of the most creative urbanists of the region, T.K. Biea, worked in almost utter obscurity. And in some sense, it was reassuring to be here the last couple of days and see some of the elders in the audience. Some of the elders who have been working 40 years, never leaving for American or European universities, oftentimes never even have access to universities, in the trenches, seeing them in this audience and appreciating their kind of commitment and how tough it was to be a kind of urban thinker and urban researcher at that time. So in some sense, what I really in some sense appreciate about this kind of process was the way in which Edgar and the way in which ACC staff really created a kind of experience where people were able to extend themselves to each other, this sense of extensiveness, of reaching out, of generosity, and above all, helping us to really stay with the promise. Thank you.
Thanks. I have some pictures. I start off with what has to be a really intensely heartfelt thank you to Edgar, Sue, Vanessa, Mercy, Warren, Nancy, others, people who arrived at the ACC and from absolutely nothing worked incredibly hard. And in the midst of all that, have been generous to so many of you. I look around and I know I've met a lot of you. It's been a pleasure to see you again. But so many of us have benefited from generosity, from space, from time, from contacts, from introductions. It's a huge contribution that the ACC has made. So I think I was so pleased, to watch this initiative in its early days, but so many thanks for the settings and venues and opportunities to learn and grow. And I think also there's so many intellectual contributions that have come out of ACC. So it's an organizational hub, but let's not forget that this has become a theoretical powerhouse of urban studies. And I think this is the question that I will come to in a minute. The main point that I want to address is, what do you do when your critique becomes the center of action? What next? So I just want to take one moment to say a thank you to my colleagues at IJA who have very kindly supported some activities here at this conference, supported a number of scholarships for African-based young scholars to attend the conference, supported a writing workshop to try and pick up, in fact, on some work that Sophie Oldfield had been doing in the South African Geography Society conference to try and support younger scholars to bring their papers forward to be ready for publication. So they will get a hearing and a review. And I'm hoping that that sort of support, which I nagged the editorial board to contribute, is something that we could imagine collectivizing more. Journals as a resource, publishing networks, the funds that we have available in institutions, how could we mobilize them to support some of the initiatives coming out of centers like the ACC and others that Teresa hinted at? So I'm hoping that the next steps will be one in which many of us, a kind of diaspora of African studies here, mobilize our resources to repay that generosity and to really get behind this initiative. So very much looking forward to that. So we are lucky in IJA. The IJA Foundation has a number of activities which are able to support scholarship in the community. So do other journals. And the reason that this has been easy to grab the attention of the board is because they're celebrating 40 years of the journal's work in encouraging international research. And we have had several regional events around the world, and IJA is very representative of different regions, very eager to concentrate its attention on supporting the work of Africa-based scholars. So you'll see there's a trial access for anybody who struggles to get hold of IJA. Jump in and download everything. Okay, so what next? That's the question I was puzzling over, having this opportunity to reflect on the conference. And I was partly wanting to be a little cheeky and resonate with urban studies history. What do we do with the history of urban studies as a whole new venture is being brought up? And I was just struck by the difference between Robert Park's idea of a marginal man on the outskirts of society and the critical review of his work, which a Chinese-American scholar, Paul Hsu, brought forward. It was published much later than the work was done. And I have to thank Dennis Rogers and Gareth Jones for bringing a group of us together to review a lot of the early Chicago School work, which I know I've criticized very vociferously in my own writing. But here we engaged again with Robert Park's very engaged research, his modest efforts to populate an understanding of the city with numerous ethnographies, with careful engagements with different contexts and so on. So here, Paul Hsu, whose work ran the fate of racism against Chinese Americans, brought forward an idea of the sojourner, somebody who moves back and forth, who's not on the outskirts of a society only, but connected into different contexts as well. And I suppose it's a metaphor that I wanted to recover a little bit, to think about the project, as Teresa has said here, of the kind of project around a Global South scholarship, but a project which has many resonances in many different contexts. in which, in order to produce any kind of Global South scholarship, we have to produce constellations of ideas and practices from different times, from different contexts. So, and I suppose the language issue that Alcindor mentioned brought to mind how the French writing about these issues often use a plural, which comes very easily in the French language, les pays du Sud, which is a plural Souths, the countries that are called Souths. So it's something I'm interested in is what happens to this concept of the South, or some of the concepts that have been part of the vocabulary of a project of a Southern turn. What happens to them as they get worked through, as a new venture goes forward, and instead of being that eccentric voice, so the grounds for a global South critique are, because really I think the best grounds is that in a sense the ways in which many places around the world have been left out of the construction of urban theory for a long time. So you can say we can stand in the global South as an eccentric position to aggressively attack the center. But that doesn't last for very long, because in fact, as we look at the Global South, we see a huge range of multiplicities, many different contexts, a great differentiation. And I think this is the one thing that I've found interesting about the sessions at this conference. Sessions which, for example, stretched from north or west to southern Africa, grappling with customary authorities, which take very different forms, have different agendas, different histories, but which bring something interesting and different to the contested configurations of governance in urban development. So both an interesting, different voice, but one which has to be appreciated in its multiplicity. So here, I think, as we explode the South into its plurality, we might do that also with the concepts that have been markers of the Global South. So markers such as informality, which stood for so long for the exception of the southern city, its impossibility of being brought into theorization. It's been a strong foundation, and still I hear people using it all over the conference. But what exactly can that mean? Is this a sensible term to use? What are we going to do over the next 10 years with such a term, which can mean so many different things? So I'll turn to think a little bit about how these concepts might be shifted through different conversations and connections. So in terms of informality, we've seen an explosion of work, really. So the concept of informality has been kind of differentiated out into many different entities, many different kinds of concepts. And here's just a list, which some of them come from Malik and others. We could put all the references there, but it's just for the sake of saying, well, what are we talking about, and what kind of conceptual project do we take forward? And if we think about many of these issues, they stretch across different contexts. So people working in a place like London can learn much from conceptual work elsewhere. I think one of the things that came up in the discussion in one of the sessions that I was working in was a sense that these kind of ghost cities that you think of not being developed. We heard about Les Cinq Chantiers from Philippe. Actually, London is got a very big ghost city of about 300,000 houses that haven't been built and may never be built, may not come forward for development. So there's something to think about, the stalling of urban development, the flipping of planning permission, the selling on of your vision. These things are conceptualizations of urbanization processes which we need to get closer to than just calling them informality. Now I'll end with a couple of quick thoughts. I was invited to give a talk some time ago at the Cities After Transition conference, which focuses on, so a bunch of urban scholars focusing on post-socialist contexts. And I was really struck when I was there. It felt like I'd come home, even though I don't know anything about those contexts. But I found a regionally embedded group of scholars grappling with urban transition, grappling with really huge changes, a disconnect between their projects and concerns and that of circulating hegemonic theorization. And I was very taken by this. So in fact, I invited a few people from there to come and join us, and we had a really interesting session discussing questions of gentrification, informality. Well, Nick Theodore's not from Eastern Europe, but he's working across many different contexts. And the overall question of transitions and governance in cities in Eastern Europe. So these, I think we might as the concept of South collects a certain constituency to contest urban conceptualization and theory. But very often, this post-socialist context is left out. It's left out again, is the story that I heard at this conference. So what they're asking is to move beyond thinking the post-socialist as a territorial container of separate regionalized theorization, and rather to think of the many different kinds of transition outcomes that you found across the region, many different kinds of connections that in fact are shaping that region, connections to other places. And we might also think of someone like Oren Yeftegel, who's asking us to jump from the south to include the east, the Middle East, he thinks. And one of the connections that it's like a very light connection, something to think with across these two contexts, I found suggestive as I was preparing to go to that conference, was monumentality. And I think this kind of gross monumentality of a kind of apartheid brutalism that we still inhabit is perhaps something we share, strangely enough, with post-socialist contexts. And here, this famous statue of Stradom in Pretoria, which Derek Hook has written very evocatively about, was picked up in a fantastic short story by Ivan Vladislavich, who's a wonderful interpreter of the spatiality of South African cities, in his story Propaganda by Monuments, which tracks the correspondence between Mr. Kumalo in Pretoria's townships, writing to a bureaucrat in Moscow, asking to please have a monument that he knows they're knocking down to put in his shebeen in Pretoria to advertise it. And he felt that all the Communist Party members in Pretoria would be very eager to come to his shebeen if he had such a monument, which indexes not just a curious morphological resonance, but also some very practical links between former socialist contexts and the South African liberation movement. What was interesting, I thought, was the autonomous collapse of the statue in 2001, to the day 40 years after the declaration of South Africa as a republic, which kind of, for me, symbolizes the shared experience of power. How fragile is power? How strong is it? How can it be overthrown? Questions of transition, which are still very much in our minds here. So I guess I'm suggesting that as the project of a global South urbanism goes forward, I would echo some of Therese's concerns about how we work with the multiplicity of Souths, how we work with the delicate, often very powerful connections linking one so-called Southern context to many other contexts through the multiple circulations and interconnections that frame our cities. So the project of creating urban studies then is not so much one of demanding a movement of eccentricity, but accepting a responsibility as a new center, a real center of theoretical production, of showing the way forward, where people are looking up to the work of scholars such as those at the ACC who are picking up these arguments and are doing something with them. How do you accept a role of leadership, generously accepting many people joining in, turning stories around, doing something different? These may be very famous people who turn to do something different because of your argument. And I think this is a marker of the fact that this great achievement of the ACC and the intellectual movement that it represents has been a wonderful success, and we look forward to the next 10 years. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and to the panelists for heartfelt and diverse perspectives. So if we can have a bit more light in the room, is that possible? And we'll open the floor for reflections, comments from you. And maybe if you do have a question to a specific panel member, you're welcome to pose that. But this is not the moment to go to page 304 of so-and-so's book and ask what exactly they meant by that paragraph. So you can catch them afterwards. Just some more light. Oh, thanks. Who's going to go first? The floor is open. Starstruck. Okay. No one. Everyone. Okay. I know.
Thank you very much. My name's Anna Taylor from the ACC, and as somebody who works, my own works between kind of climate science and urban studies, and in a real effort to try and understand some of the kind of complexities and diversity of African cities, I've been grappling with trying to understand some of the principles and practices of transdisciplinarity in my work. And so when I heard Raoul from Toro Lab mention the ideas of contradisciplinarity and anti-disciplinarity, I was very struck by those terms and what they might mean for our work, and what they might mean in terms of sort of understanding and articulating southern cities or African cities differently, particularly in a time when when the calls for decolonizing knowledge and education is so strong, particularly here at UCT. And so I was just very interested. It felt, that thought has been sort of circulating in my head, and it felt like there were some connection points to a few things that were said on the panel. So I was just interested to possibly hear some reflections on what anti or contradisciplinarity might mean in a sort of African studies, urban studies setting.
Okay, Blessing Bero, African Population Health Research Center, APHRC, Nairobi. It's a pleasure for me also being here, and I lead the urbanization program at APHRC, and I live here clear, for instance, from what the sessions I also attended, that the whole idea of African exceptionalism in terms of urbanization is actually not real, because I listened to a lot of presentations, showing African urbanization as actually normal in terms of its composition. For example, the issue of informality. I really saw informality across the region, okay, and it seems normal, and cities grappling almost with the same kind of issues, from one example after another example, from Karonga to Nairobi to different parts of Africa. So, and I think that I take away that the fact that there are a lot of commonalities. Of course, that does not mean there are no differences. I also saw some differences. But that commonality shows that the heart of urban Africa is beating, and they have some of them very similar challenges. I also saw moving away from identifying problems, which are very important, but I also see a lot of moving towards solutions. I saw a lot of testing of models of, for example, addressing slums, addressing challenges. I saw that across, and I think I take away that the issue of looking for problems, looking for not looking beyond problems to look at solutions. I also saw some testing of models of change that works. I was here yesterday, and I was looking at the presentation from Kenya and one from Port Harcourt, which is actually where I come from, very close to where I come from. So the fact that it's almost the same kind of model, trying to energize citizens to act. So in a way, I take that away. The other thing I wanted to raise is the issue of, I saw some gaps in participation. I mean, it will always be there, but for ACC, I think it's a challenge. ACC seems to be in another continent. Okay, so, and those coming from the heart of Africa actually keep thinking it is going to another country. I looked at participation. Apart from those who have projects and who research programs that are connecting to either partners in ACC or partners in Europe, they're actually those that I saw. I didn't see, I mean, he mentioned Akim Obogunje, for instance, even in the panels. Okay, it's relieving that somebody came from Nigeria, but I mean, you can't talk about urbanization in Africa and Nigeria is not really there. So it's just to be able to, yeah, it's just to be able to say, I saw that gap, but I mean, it's not to indict ACC, but to challenge that Africa is really bigger than Southern Africa. Thank you.
I feel like Oprah.
Thank you all. My name is, sorry. What did you say? Can you hear me? So thank you. My question is, I'm really compelled to stay with this expression about staying with the promise. And I think here we've said we need to stay with the promise theoretically. But how about what do we need to do to stay with the promise materially? When people are tired of being infrastructure for cholera, or they're tired of being the incremental bridge for someone who's buried someone because of, you know? What does it mean to keep with the promise materially? That's just my question, because I think we focus a lot on the theoretical.
Okay. Anyone else before we give to the panel to respond? Right.
Just following up that question of staying with the promise, I'm interested to know also how we think about decolonization when now we have sort of new waves of all these big companies coming, invest in new projects. We are witnessing all these sort of similar processes of new foreign capitals coming, or even from South Africa to Mozambique, or the between African countries, we see also kind of different ways of intervening in other countries. So I want to also stay with I want to know what it means of staying with the promise of decolonization in the current increasingly privatized spaces all over the place. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Dinath. I'm from the Johannesburg Development Agency. Thanks for a lot of great content over the last 3 days, but I'm going to be speaking from the other side almost, and I feel like it's the other side. We're a development agency that's made a conscious effort to be more innovative and to learn from research and to be a continuously improving organization. My plea to everybody here who's presented amazing work and some great data, both quantitative, qualitative, is that you bring your work a little bit closer for us to interact with. It's very difficult to absorb the learning into the practice world if that gap is too far. And so, we'll keep coming to learning events like this, and we'll keep trying to absorb as much as possible. But my plea is that you understand the governance systems, the worlds in which we operate, frustrating as they may be, bureaucratic as they may be, there are still spaces of possibility inside, especially inside local government. But often, it's just too much of a gap. And I struggle to bring that back to the practitioners that I've got to convince inside government.
Okay, so I think we'll give back to the panel to maybe, if they have thoughts, reflections, and then we can do another round. I think you've got microphones.
I just want to say very briefly something on the question of the transdisciplinarity. I think I can say something about that. Maybe, I think that's where I stay. it's definitely not easy to work in a transdisciplinary way. Maybe Raul could explain what he means by anti or contra-disciplinary. So I think that would be great. But what I think is that for us to work, what does it require from us to work in a transdisciplinary way? I think it requires lots of patience and lots of willingness to listen to and to learn how to operate in a way that is not the one we are usually operating with. And this is frustrating, and this requires lots of willingness to deconstruct things, but especially, I think, willingness to just learn and to train ourselves. Like anthropologists train ourselves in other languages all the time. We learn languages, and I think it's the same thing. You have to learn another language almost, as if you want to do this work. And I think that's how I would think about it. But anyway, let's. Malik, I think you have to keep the ball.
Oh, I have to? Okay. No, I mean, the question is, what is the materiality of an endurance of everyday life? And at one level, there are all of these insufficiencies that can be identified. So what are the mechanisms through which there can be a different kind of consolidation of resourcefulness? What is possible? And I think one of Achille's arguments is that in the sense that the circulation of bodies is not just the circulation of people from one economic center of gravity to another, but how do you create a kind of demand, a demand that in some sense dissipates the kinds of borders, dissipates the kinds of playing off of each other, dissipates the kind of blockages that allows particular spaces to be folded into as new asset classes, as new extensions of kind of spatial products. What kind of thing will create the kind of demand that will, in some sense, relinquish these kinds of weird territorializations that in some ways facilitate the incursion of all these kinds of and also to look at when you ask the question about the recolonization. I mean, who inhabits these things? Who occupies these things? What are they used for? What kind of longevity do they have? What kind of impact do they have? In what ways can they be appropriated or dismantled or subverted? I mean, these kinds of things are being blanketed across the world. What do they really do? How can they be actually used and inhabited? I think these remain fundamental questions. But in some ways, what worries me about of course, everyday life is a kind of material challenge for the majority of residents in many parts of the world. But in some ways, if one just always begins with the kind of list and sense of insufficiencies, how does that detract or support from the capacity of people to somehow make a demand that is effective in terms of reconstituting the kind of political agenda and the political kinds of environment in which they live? So I think Achille's point is that's not just because the sense of a pan-African circulation, but a sense of circulation will enable a kind of exchange, a kind of distribution of intelligence and histories and ideas and capacities that in some sense constitute the basis for a much more effective kind of political demand.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the question of the waves of investment and the plea for ideas that might come closer to practice. And I think that, one has to, some back and forth between the critical and the propositional, I think, is the nub of the matter. So on the one hand, I think attending to this wave of transnationalized interest in extracting value across Africa, which is going to intersect soon, and I don't know whether it'll be a beneficial or a harmful standing wave with the hoped for investment coming through the more humanitarian developmental project of the SDGs. How will these come together? So obviously, as scholars, we can study the complexities, the power relationships, the mobilities, the actors and interests in these new kinds of urban spaces being produced, extended, fragmented, dispersed. You know, there's so much to explore and think about. But propositionally, I think there's something that we could also bring to the ambition to improve ways of implementing development. So I think one of the things that perplexes me is the tension between this highly trans-scalar, transnationalized, complex set of political constellations that are producing certain kinds of urban outcomes across this continent and others, and the imagination of what kinds of governance solutions are needed for many contexts where clearly urban governance is a challenge and poorly resourced and so on. How does engagement with these trans-scalar actors operate? What kinds of capacities, at what kind of territorial, in what kind of territorial format, with what kind of brief to engage with these processes? It's not clear that that fits into a developmental imagination where you have participatory local government capacitated to manage markets and blah, 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 where you got to talk to the Chinese investment bank and the president of the country clearly wants his payoff. So I think there's definitely a need for this conversation, and it's imperative, I think, that we do learn to speak more confidently about the critical work that we do in a propositional vein. But of course, the propositional side is tied to power. You know, it's tied to who will listen to what policy, what translates for national governments making a decision at some high table. It's a challenge, and I would agree that we have to work together more to be more creative in this ambitious critical propositionality.
Thanks. I'm going to go back to the floor so we can do one quick round of just final comments, questions before we close, and then we'll draw the afternoon to a close.
No, I mean, these are my notes, it's not a tweet, sorry. So I'm Morten Nielsen from Aarhus University. So this has been really an amazing experience and an amazing event. And I think that one of the things that these 3 days have given at least me is not just an opportunity to, in a sense, try to stretch my conceptual boundaries of what the city can be thought to be, but also to think about how I conceptualize the city, right? And I appreciated kind of the list that you gave, Jen, with the long list of how the city is. So, but what I'm thinking about now is just, if I could ask you to reflect a bit more about that, you could say, the nature of the kinds of conceptualizations that we are currently investing ourselves in, right? I mean, you could say the kinds of abstractions, the kinds of generalizations that we're doing. You could also say, what happens to our engagement with the urban when we move from, let's say, the marginal man over the sojourner to the major cleavages of the Manchester school, to the the holes and nuts that Philip de Burgh has given us, right? So where are we now in terms of the conceptualization of the city? Both what are the opportunities that we are given, but also what are some of the constraints and what don't we see?
Okay, nice simple question. Anyone else? Last going. Can't the lights are bright? No? Good? We're done? Okay. Good. Good, you asked such a simple question. Oh, sorry. I'll give all of you a round to make a final remark.
I think the last comment that I would like to make is that the linkage between what we produce as kind of a conceptual academic thinking and how to help, I think someone raised this question, how to help translate it into practice. I think on the one hand is the kinds of questions that we ask in our research, the way we look at our own environments, and who we listen to and how we try to read and interpret what's going on. Because there is a tendency in the kind of political practitioner world to try and find solutions that would fit all. But with the research, we see that it is important to kind of go deep and try and look at the specific as well. In terms of how do we pass on the messages, I think it has also to do with the kinds of language. Again, I would come back, the kinds of language that we use to communicate some of those ideas and how are they kind of taken in by those who would be in charge of implementing things on the ground. And I think there is also a tension that we need to work on in both sides. And having been with United Nations in the last couple of years, I see that tension in terms of wanting something that is quick and dirty and can have a solution immediately, but also on the other hand, the need to kind of go deep and look at these things more carefully. So that tension is there, and we need to see how to deal with it. Yeah.
Thanks. Malik, surely quick and dirt is a good segue to you.
Okay, just to say that I think it's important to always pay attention to what is it that we have amidst many different ways of having. As Stokely Carmichael once said, how have we come this far? That is, how have we endured? To pay attention to that endurance, pay close attention to that endurance. What have we done with that endurance? And to always be careful that things undertaken in the name of the imminence of the loss of human life have always historically been mobilized to suppress life. So to always be careful of that kind of argument. So in that sense, be willing to extend ourselves out to appreciate what it is that we have and how it is that we have come so far.
It's not that I cannot add much to that, but maybe I would say things in a little different way and come back to the point that Malik made before. So I think that obviously we have some huge challenges in terms of the kind of interventions that we want to create. And I think that obviously we know that we have to be creative, but we also have to pay attention not to try to reinvent the wheel all the time. I think Malik reminded us, and is reminding us again, of the people who have done incredible urban research in the last 40 years and maybe have not been able to be in other environments. I learned more about urban theory with my professors at the University of São Paulo than I learned at Berkeley in many ways. So I think that we have to recognize there is an incredible amount of accumulated knowledge on urban theory that it's out there. We don't have to reinvent it. We don't have to throw it away because some of my old professors were inspired by the Chicago School, but that's what they had at the moment, but they did something else with that knowledge, and I think we should just not have to reinvent all the work they have done. So I think that our task, in a way, is to recoup. It's a challenge because, for example, I try to teach, and here's one of the main challenges, I try to teach that knowledge in the United States. It's impossible. Also published in Portuguese. So we have these barriers that we have to deal with. And if it's published in Portuguese, it's not going to be read here. It's going to be read only in a few countries in the world. So we have tasks of translations, we have tasks of reinterpretation, but I think that our job is to exactly navigate through this, our imagination for the new challenge that we have, and this dialogue with what came before us, and also not only in the global south, but also in the North Atlantic. So we're not going to abandon entirely all the discussions of urban theory in the North Atlantic. We're just going to have to talk to it as we have to talk to our histories and our local histories and navigate through this.
Great. So I think, this is a good question we have here. What don't we see? What are the opportunities and constraints in building new stories about the urban? And I guess it's picking up a bit on Blessing's point that he made at the beginning of the discussion, so who's included in that conversation? And I think this is really the challenge of the next decade. So I think the conceptual battle has been pretty well won. I think there's a great agenda driven by the globalized nature of the urban world. Many people are eager to learn, to think with, to read about different contexts, and to imagine a different theorization of the urban. But the problem is there's a lot of people who are not part of that conversation, and it's not clear that people should be. So there's disparate and different conversations, which mean important things to people in different contexts, or some subsection of people who think about the urban. So I'm not saying that we have to be one big happy conversation. But there's some really, and a conference which is focusing more on African cities, we just have to notice the diasporic, to put it politely, nature of ourselves, and the real challenge of building, of supporting the coming forward of voices from places where people are certainly doing great work, not coming into the conversation at all, really struggling as scholars. So I think this is for me, it's who gets to speak about the urban is much more important than who can be terribly clever and write a fancy theory and solve the problem of, the global urban. So, yes, we're all busy doing that, fine. But I think this is really, really a serious challenge. But it has another side to it, which is who listens in a different voice, in a different idiom, in a different language, in a different way of writing about different things. And I'm, again and again, I feel like, I don't know how the people who've been doing this for 50 years feel, but, 20 years later, I have to say, I feel sometimes really defeated at trying to explain to colleagues that if something is written in a different idiom, it doesn't conform to what you think a book should be, it doesn't look exactly like the journal article that's going to get a 4-star on some UK ref, although we should change that too, but you should listen to it, you should read it, pay attention. So it's a serious task of learning and unlearning to be done still. So I think we can celebrate the proliferation of our analytical inventiveness. We love the scholars from long ago, Simmel, Benjamin. What a pleasure to grapple with problems alongside them. Fabulous. We have this whole heritage of African urban studies to really benefit from. But going forward, we're in a great deal of trouble about making a new form of urban theory. Sorry, not very positive.
Great. Thanks to our fantastic closing panel. So before my colleagues ran a bit late, I want to do two things. I want to do, we've got time, I want to do a proper vote of thanks because it takes an enormous amount of effort and time and resources and people and goodwill and good humor to organize something like this and to pull it off. And I'll make one closing remark. So I can't, okay, so I'll start with a vote of thanks. So first off, we obviously corralled many people to do the keynote sessions, to do the chairing of the different panels and so forth. And a lot of that was also enabled by the Hydra Foundation. So we just want to acknowledge all of you and thank you, and particularly as participants for attending the conference. We were pleasantly surprised that UCT has a wonderful professional infrastructure to support this kind of thing in terms of tech and in terms of keeping things clean. And this space has worked much better than any private facility that I've used in the past. So I want to acknowledge the UCT colleagues from ICTS who've been outstanding and professional. The book lounge has, of course, supported us. It's a huge cost for them to have 2 full-time staff members here, carry heavy boxes, although Alma did chip in. You can rest for a week from your bench pressing, Alma. And then we had Kurt Johnson helping with the AV and enabling us to stream. Thank you, Kurt. Then there was a whole production team. I can't tell you, you can't possibly imagine if you're not from UCT how ugly the Leslie building is. So these people have done absolute magic to transform that space. Kathy Page Wood, Hajira van Oudtshoorn, Kamal and the team and all the ushers. And then that was made possible because it was enveloped by an exhibition that was curated by Sabina Favaro, and I'd love Sabina to just stand up and wave, and please. So just so you know, Sabina's an architect who actually works for one of the toughest NGOs in Cape Town on really complicated problems, and I had coffee with in November and twisted, and eventually her arm gave way and she agreed to do the design work. So Sabina, thank you, and I know that I was the worst possible client you could have had. If your client doesn't reply to an email, you're kind of stuffed. But Sabina still pushed on, and with Alma they were able to do all of these beautiful things that just added and made everything fantastic. And in addition to that, we had a great back-end support team in ACC that has money and transactions and so forth. So those of you who still need to be paid, you will be paid, don't worry. Ithra Najjar, Marlene Hubert, Mariam Wagley, and Chandra Hubert, all wonderful. We had a scientific committee that oversaw the review of the abstracts and the submissions and so forth. Andy Tucker, Deputy Director at ACC, Sophie Oldfield, Urban Studies Professor at ACC, Catherine Hyman, and Caroline Skinner, and thank you for your service. It was, as you can imagine, an immense task to review all of that and to provide feedback and so forth. And then finally, there are 2 people that were really central to all of this. Firstly, Alma Viviers, if she can come to the front, please. So all of the beauty and the design and the branding and the tweeting and the social media and so forth, she somehow single-handedly pulls off, and yeah, really deeply appreciated. And then, of course, the absolute linchpin to everything, Catherine Hyman. So just so that you know, she is actually Dr. Catherine Hyman, and she's just finished the postdoc with us and is about to go and kick some butt in the public sector of the Western Cape as a lead on their infrastructure research program. in the Western Cape government, so we're also saying goodbye for now. We regard it as a sabbatical, so that she can pay off her student loans and then come back and work for slave wages again. So, Catherine, thank you, really, thank you. So I just want to make one closing point and just one sort of advertorial. So this is where you need to be tonight to get your groove on. So that's the waterfront. That's Mully Point, where you take a walk and you pretend you can't smell the excrement in the sea, because the view does kind of compensate, so you do forget. And it's called the Oceana Power Boat Club, so any Uber will get you there. Which we recommend, cash bar. So, you know, stick 8, as we would say in Cape Town. So I want to make one point, and it's a response to Jenny's provocation about what next and where we go. And I guess at the core of that is a conception of the future, right? And how we think about the future and how we understand the present that we are in. And whether that present moment is overdetermined by paying attention to Zimmel, to Benjamin, to Fanon, or whatever, or whether that present is overdetermined by a sense of anticipation of all that we don't understand, of all that is coming at us that we can't possibly comprehend. And that sense of anticipation, that sense of futurity, is also about how one positions oneself, how one pivots oneself geographically. So yes, Southern we know is not a literal construct, but there's something about understanding that, you know, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, the world will be a profoundly different place. And making a conscious decision that you will work backwards from where the world will be in 20 years' time and its multiple centralities as a reference point that informs one's modesty, one's ambition, and one's orientation. And I can't think of someone who captures that more powerfully than another fantastic Congolese artist, also called Baloji. And I want to close the conference as we started on a musical note, on an artistic intervention, and leave you with this powerful sense of futurity that hopefully will not just carry us and the spirit of this conference and the debates and the generosity forward, but will also incite different ways of inhabiting hope, of anticipation, and that wonderful phrase that we're left with today, staying with a promise. And thank you for being here.
These things were brought for the women in my soul. I cannot be forgotten forever again. Kinshasa. La météo annonce une pluie de météores sur le Kivu et la façade nord. Même les nuages ici sont menaçants. Optimisme vigilant. Utopie concrète. Les lois remplacent ici les amulettes. Larmes, sueur, sang. Le Saint Graal est minéral. Pandémie subtropicale. Nommé un président par intérim. Ici de l'ancien régime. Appel volontaire. Au bureau des contentieux. On traite une affaire de fauteuil pour deux. Comme à Gao, après le déluge. La foi n'est pas une valeur refuge. These things were brought for the women in my soul. Tous ces victimes, tous ces victimes. I cannot be forgotten forever again. Tous ces victimes, tous ces victimes. Les chèvres deviennent carnivores aux abords des états-majors, au ministère des impondérables. pour instaurer une paix durable. Faut choisir entre la paix ou la justice, ou la vengeance des petits-fils. Facteur exponentiel, cherchez le signe providentiel. Danseur, Capharnaüm, pas le service minimum. Ode à la lutte, la résilience, le but, la black excellence. These things were brought for the women in my soul. Tous ces victimes, I cannot be forgotten forever again. Kinshasa.
Someone with a fancy new MacBook Pro left their charger somewhere in the conference.
Avant on disait qui ordine. Maintenant c'est qui boit, din. Unité élite. Voir de la sueur, tout sec. Soupçon de moiteur, tout sec. Voir une lueur, tout sac. Fendre la noirceur, tout sac. L'économie est low bat. Coup de bas, roulate. Eau de vie écarlate, dilate. À moitié vidé, à moitié plein. $1 la 7,5, fini les coups d'usée sur le zinc. La mine déconfite, ingurgite de l'eau bénite, pure white spirit. Minute, t'es là, le nez dans ta chope. Comme si tu regardais ta vie au microscope. Entre le mortier et le pilon, qu'importe le flacon, l'ivresse est dans le houblon. Plus de sucre que de malt, 5 litres dans le sang. Dehors les brasseries distillent, leur case comme des barils. Logique de la marche sur le volume, un litron coûte moins cher qu'un légume. Ils font le monoclient de seconde zone pour remplacer les taxiphones. Braquage à la caisse, c'est l'impôt direct. Et ta monnaie revient à la côte.
masanga ekopesa bokasi ojogo.
Tu mets la main main, je ne mettrai pas les pieds propres, comme au figuré, en état d'ébriété avancé, rescapé, en apnée. Tu mets la main, je ne mettrai pas les pieds au propre, comme au figuré, en état d'ébriété avancé. Sponsorise l'habitude, leur logo sur chaque mur, pour que tu danses jusqu'à l'autre, sur des spots de pluie qui vendent les dos, qui nous en tuent. Chansons non d'ouragan, dont les refrains sont comme des slogans. Puis de délits flagrants, des bracelets, joue les labels, à la courte paille, à la courte chaîne. Plus de budget clé, mes mystères sont mystères, sur le public dans la surenchère. Commande de l'éthique et ses variantes, campagne de intentions criantes. Décrier, lui donner favori, leur messie, voir du dernier cri. Meuf, catégorie, premier prix, pour $1, le repas est compris. Retour sur investissement, chantier revêtement, c'est clairement de l'asservissement, avertissement sans frais. C'est à l'alcool mauvais.
Broken away,